Treasury has today announced that they have secured a $1.5 billion World Bank loan. It is intended for easing infrastructure bottlenecks to boost economic growth and create jobs in the country. They go on to say that the funds will support reforms in the electricity, freight and logistics, as well as water and sanitation sectors, which it described as critical to unlocking inclusive growth and reducing unemployment. To talk to us this evening about whether this was the right move by government, we are joined by Dr Dale McKinley from the Research and Education at the International Labour Research and Information Group. He is a Research and Education Officer there. Dr McKinley, welcome to African Business. Good to have you with us.
Thanks, Thami. Always good to be here.
So here we are, another loan, this time $1.5 billion from the World Bank. What are your views on this?
Well, I think that the fact that we're borrowing money is not always a good thing. So I think the first thing is that in some ways what this indicates, and this is, by the way, the fourth World Bank facility that we've used in the last 4 years. So we've averaged one a year in the last 4 years. And if you look at our borrowing capacity and our debt to GDP ratio, it's not exactly the best move in my estimation, because what it indicates is the government is saying to itself that it doesn't have, first of all, its own internal financial capacity to fund what it wants to fund in this case, and that in some ways it's an admittance of failure on its part to deal with the problems that is identified for a long time in these three sectors that are being targeted, which are freight, electricity generation, and then obviously water and sanitation in particular. So my sense is that while it might have, there could be some potentially positive things that come out of this, in larger macro terms, it's an indication that the government hasn't done its job.
So looking at the figures that you've just highlighted now, the fact that this is the fourth World Bank facility in 4 years, this doesn't seem to bode well, because it looks like every single year we are knocking at their doors cap in hand.
Absolutely, and as most of the rest of the African countries and in the global South know, the World Bank, well, in this case it's from their development facility, but they always come with conditions. They always come with a particular agenda, and that agenda, generally speaking, is, if you read the terms of this loan, are to enhance private investment. Now, there's nothing principally wrong with that, but what that does indicate to us is that over the last many years, all of these billions and hundreds of billions that we've poured into state-owned enterprises, that we poured into public facilities and services, they're telling us that hasn't worked, and now we're going to have to turn to external forces to borrow more money in order to make it work. And so, yes, it's not a good look.
Was the World Bank a good option, or could there have been other options, especially, as you said, it's from the development facility?
Look, there always are other options. I mean, you could go to the African Development Bank. You could go to other EU facilities. There's even, of course, there's the Chinese Export and Development Facility that we have used in the past. So yes, there are other options. But I think this has this is not simply about borrowing 1.5 million US dollars, which in relative terms is a fairly small amount in developmental terms. It's about what it says ideologically and politically about where the government is putting its eggs in which basket. Because the World Bank has gotten a lot of criticism over the years, particularly from our continent. But what they're saying now is, look, this is where we want to go. So this is not simply about borrowing money. It's about strengthening relationships with particular countries in the North, in particular, that have always been dominant in the World Bank group.
And Treasury says this loan, this $1.5 billion loan, will be paid back in 15 years. Is this realistic?
Sure, it is realistic, but it's going to come at a cost. As we all know, when you borrow money and when you pay it back, there are obviously, even if there are lower interest rates, that's one element, and that bumps up your interest capacity in terms of the debt to GDP ratio, as I've mentioned. But it also means that you oftentimes have to shift money. If you haven't been able to grow your economy and you haven't been able to get more tax revenue, which is questionable, let's say, in the next 2 or 3 years, in terms of our growth potential, then what that means is you're going to have to divert resources in order to pay that interest. And that, if that happens, well, we usually know where that comes from and what gets cut. And so that could have some knock-on impacts in relation to the repayment. But it's realistic, but it does come with costs.
Failure in governance is a big problem for our country. We often have, great strategies, but fall flat when it comes to implementation and management, of those funds. How are they going to manage this particular process?
Yeah, that's a good question, Thami, because my sense is that the Treasury is going to play a really very central role here in ensuring that things are followed. If you look at the presidency in terms of the infrastructural, this is really about an infrastructural development project, and in some ways it's been centralized within the presidency. So my sense is the presidency and Treasury will drive this for the most part, and there'll be sort of particular relationships with, for example, private operators and calls for investment and the port facility in Durban and so forth. So I think that in this case, what the lesson that at least possibly positively has been learned is that once you devolve things down to a particular level, it often gets even messier. So while there might be concerns around the central authorities that are dealing with this, in procedural terms, it's probably the better way to go.
Mm. So we've seen, and you mentioned this earlier on, state-owned enterprises collapsing over the years. We've also seen, millions, if not billions, being pumped into these SOEs, yet not with much turnaround. Except there has been progress if you look at around Transnet, etc. But it really has been slow and not comparative to the amount of financing that has been channeled in that direction. What is going to be different this time around, and how is government going to ensure, consistency and maintenance at these state-owned enterprises?
Yeah, well, again, a very good question, and I think it sort of hits the nail on the head in terms of why we're getting this facility. It's about further privatization. If you look at if you look at the World Bank statement on this loan, they're basically saying that in the water and sanitation sector, it's about bringing private operators in. In the freight sector, it's about more competition in terms of the private sector. In the port facility, it's about supporting the concession that we've given to a private operator to run the Durban port facility. And this has generally been the agenda. So what that means is that government, in this case, is deciding that it's in some ways moving away from that state-owned enterprise sort of centric thinking and approach, and it's saying, look, we failed, essentially. I mean, even though they're never going to say that publicly, but we failed to transform the state-owned enterprises. They're still mired. I mean, there has been some improvements in places like Eskom and Transnet, yes, okay, but we still have huge problems in most of our state-owned enterprises with massive leakages, corruption, mismanagement, and so forth. And they're basically saying, look, that fight, we've tried it, but now we're going to shift and we're going to pivot towards the private sector. And the World Bank is more than happy to support that with money. So that has to be understood, that what this really emphasizes and this sort of trend, it's not just this loan, but a range of them, is the GNU in particular shifting towards a realization from themselves. We can debate as to whether they're correct or not, but themselves that the way to go forward is more privatization, bringing in competition, and not having the dominance of the state-owned enterprises.
What we are seeing and have seen in South Africa over the recent past are the various commissions that have been put in place that have highlighted the depths of the rot and the corruption in government and in association with business as well. What are the measures that have been put in place to mitigate that risk, to really ensure that this $1.5 billion is really going to go towards the projects that it has been earmarked for, and that it's not going to end up being, a gravy train for some tenderpreneur?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously I can't answer that question in full because I'm not in government and running this program, but I could say that my sense is that you look at the trajectory, that Treasury in particular, I mean, just in the last couple of weeks, what did Treasury announce? It announced that it was basically withholding the equitable share from over 60 municipalities because of, corruption and mismanagement. Now, That can again be debated as to whether that's the right approach. But my sense is that in this case, the centralization of the procedural nature of this loan and making sure that it doesn't get into hands down at the local or should we say provincial levels or within state-owned enterprises. In some ways, what this is doing is bypassing that terrain and putting it directly into the hands of bilateral agreements and contracts that will probably be signed with particular operators, in this case private operators, to do the things in each of those three sectors. So my sense is that that's what probably Treasury is going to do in order to say that they're trying to avoid and trying to basically bypass the possibilities that this could get, as you say, mired in the same kind of corrupt sort of swamp that has been so experienced in the past.
Dr. Dale McKinley, thank you so much for putting that into perspective for us, this $1.5 billion loan from the World Bank. We thank you for your time, sir.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay. Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye.
That's Dr. Dale McKinley. He is a research and education officer at the International Labour Research and Information Group. He brings us to exactly 6:19 Central African Time.